White House officials are telling NBC News policing and racial justice will be a featured portion of the president's speech to a joint session of Congress tomorrow night ahead of his 100th day in office. He's also expected to make a big push for the Police Reform Act named after George Floyd. Axios reporting tonight he'll ask Congress to pay nearly $2 trillion for his plan to boost health care, child care, education in our country. Tomorrow's address will be the first big event inside the Capitol since that January 6th insurrection and looting. There will be a significant retightening of security with fencing remaining around the Capitol and a National Guard presence around the Capitol. Health restrictions mean that about 200 people in all will be in that House chamber. It's huge. It is big enough to house 1,600. As we mentioned, Biden will give his speech at the exact location where the insurrectionists tried to prevent him from taking office. Prosecutors have now, in fact, charged 2 rioters in connection with the death of the U.S. Capitol Police officer Brian Sicknick. However, the feds now say they attacked Sicknick with a chemical spray not believed to be bear spray, as first reported. Also today, a federal judge decided that the rioter who posed for a photo with his feet up on the desk in Speaker Pelosi's suite of offices should be released from jail to await trial. A judge ruled that he did not present the kind of danger to society that would require pretrial detention. Carol Leonnig, tomorrow evening's visual is going to be striking, and it's going to be a first. A president of the United States with 2 women behind him, Vice President and Speaker of the House, people who haven't seen Capitol Television since 1/6 may be struck by the fact that someone else is at the dais other than the QAnon shaman wearing the Chewbacca mankini with horns. But speaking of 1/6 and what happened in the neighboring Senate chamber, tell me they're doing everything possible to make the Capitol safe tomorrow night.
I think we can all rest easy that they are actually doing everything physically possible, Brian. And I think that, everyone is on keen alert. This is essentially, again, the inauguration all over again, when there were 25,000 National Guard and federal law enforcement forces surrounding the Capitol to make sure that a headline could be written later that day, which nobody would have imagined would need to be written. President Biden returns to White House safely after inauguration. That's the kind of protection, although not that number of forces, obviously, but that's the level of basically on guard quality that we're going to see. Part of the reason for this, Brian, is not just that January 6th happened and people know now that that kind of attack is possible. We no longer have the failure, unfortunately, of imagination. We can imagine what that was like with the man with the horns, with the people storming, with some people who were in militia gear taking flagpoles into the chests of police officers. So that failure of imagination is not going to happen again. But there is another issue besides whether or not a siege happens, and that is that law enforcement is very concerned about the constant rhetoric that you are hearing in different news channels, and including from the former president, that is manifest in people taking out their rage, their violence, because they believe that the election is illegitimate and they believe the president is illegitimate. And that leads people who are not stable or are upset to do things that are really dangerous, to get rifles, to figure out places where they have a clean shot. And so, of course, everyone is going to be taking every precaution possible for this night, even though the risk may be relatively low compared to January 6th, when the president urged followers to come to the Capitol and stop the certification of the vote.
It's a chilling business, suddenly. Professor Carol just used the word imagination in her answer. I'm going to ask you to use yours and your life's work at the highest levels of the law. What would you like to hear from the President of the United States on the topic of social justice tomorrow night?
Well, I think we're going to hear, and I think it'll be welcomed by many constituencies, more talk about policing, the need to build trust within communities of color and marginalized communities around the country with the police. And that really depends a lot on more transparency and more accountability. So I think that will be a big point. Other questions of social justice don't necessarily have anything to do with criminal justice, but again, the sort of economic concerns that we've seen plague this country throughout the course of this pandemic. We know that the president will unveil his American Families Plan tomorrow night. That's a really important piece of policy for a lot of people, including many of the women who left the workforce in record numbers during this pandemic, so much so that it was termed a she session. Thinking about infrastructure in terms of the scaffolding of care work that people need in order to be able to do their jobs is vitally important to all Americans who work and for their families who depend on their work. And so, again, those questions of social justice, economic justice, racial justice are inextricably intertwined. And I think we'll see a lot of that tomorrow night.
Ashley, think of what we've seen unfold in that chamber just over the past couple presidential terms. We have heard the words, "You lie," shouted out. Heckler, member of the House of Representatives, while the president of the United States was speaking. We have seen the Speaker of the House very publicly and theatrically rip up the president's speech behind him on the dais. None of that expected tomorrow night. But talk about what you might be listening for from Joe Biden about how he plans to govern post 100 days.
Well, I will be listening for all of that because that is the key question. President Biden and his team came in with a very rigorous and thorough plan for his first 100 days. They had tracked every single one of his campaign pledges and promises and had executive orders and legislation and bits of policy ready to go to try to make good on them. They came in believing, correctly probably, that his presidency would rise and fall on his handling of the coronavirus crisis, and they immediately made that a top priority. He had very specific 100-day benchmarks, wearing a mask for 100 days, 100 shots in arms in the first 100 days, getting the majority of school children back to school in the first 100 days. And after that is a really open question. Like all presidents, he is grappling with the stuff that you can't pledge and promise in pre-script. There is a crisis on the nation's southern border. He has upset the activists wing of the party with how he handled refugee caps. He is still dealing with issues with systematic racism and policing and gun violence. And those are all things that don't have overnight solutions and can't be solved with an executive order. So anything he says on any of those topics will be fascinating. And the last point is of the 4 crises he mentioned when he took office, he has made real strides that he can point to on coronavirus, the economy, and climate change. The thing that is the biggest challenge for him and eludes him is the racial equity, racial justice part. We know he plans to address that in the speech, but what he says and what ground map he lays out will be particularly of interest.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.